Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Intentionally Act Live, and I'm Enrico Manalo, Chief of Learner Success at All Aces Inc. Today, we're going back to basics for the last day of Black History Month, and our angle for today is how do you decide which cultural heritage months to celebrate in the workplace? Organizations often play lip service to cultural heritage months, and even the idea that DEI is important to attracting and retaining their workforce. However, these acknowledgments or appreciations can fall flat when organizations don't connect to Heritage Month celebrations and DEI on a personal or even emotional level. Today, on the last day of Black History Month, we're going to be sharing the experience of Team All Aces to help connect the importance of earnest appreciation of identity and cultural celebration. So, what's in it for you? What many organizations and people miss out on is the opportunity to develop earnest interest and appreciation of people and cultures that may be very different from what they know. In short, we can appreciate what we don't know. Further, we're not likely to develop appreciation of different people if we're not connecting to those opportunities from places of authenticity. At the end of the day, what's most important is actually doing the work, not talking about doing the work. From that perspective, one of the ways to actually do the work is to connect to the cultural heritage months and celebrations that your workplace is authentically invested in and to develop those calendar opportunities into appreciation that exists as part of your everyday in the workplace. With me today to talk about this, excuse me, are Janeen Williamson, Communications Manager, and Moses Collins III, Executive Assistant, both at All Aces Inc. So the first thing I want to turn to everyone is why is it important to celebrate cultural heritage in the workplace?
We have talked about this a lot lately for many different reasons. But I think one of the reasons, if we're just kind of being honest, is that the cultural months and the days that are on the calendar were created because they needed to be created. There was this challenge that, the dominant narrative, especially when you're thinking about history, is that American history is white history.
Yeah.
Or, culture, we don't see, the differences of other people in the workplace. I remember there was like a time where it was well known or well said that, like, I don't see color, right? Like that was a thing at some point. But when you don't see color, you're actually erasing the person's identity that is a person of color. And
Mm.
so, we had to have these opportunities to say, like, this is me. I'm bringing myself to the workplace. I'm bringing my history, my culture, all different parts of who I am to be celebrated. And that's kind of where it started from.
Hmm.
I love that, Janine. I love also, especially that part about celebrating the our identities and those things that are different, right? So, um, finding out what those differences are and acknowledging that we have those differences do exist, and how can we use them as a community in total.
And we've got a comment coming in from a dear friend of ours, Stephen Walker. If you don't celebrate, then you aren't able to acknowledge the people's true humanity and identity. Thank you for that, Stephen. Any thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, I mean, that's so true. If there's this idea, like when I come to work, you see me, I'm a Black woman, but you might not know that, like, my grandmother's Jamaican. And so, Jamaican heritage and having that as part of my identity is really important to me. And I would love to have a workplace, an environment where, like, I can bring that, I can share that. There are certain things about being Jamaican that are like, we're extremely relational people, right? Like relationships matter to me. That's one of the core things that I bring to the workplace that makes me me and makes me good at the work that I do. And so if I was able to share that part of my culture, then maybe you'd understand me better.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. So I see that a lot these days. Companies talking about like, well, come join us. You can be your full self at work, but like, what does that really mean? What does that look like? And obviously, these calendar celebrations aren't the sum total of that, but they do provide kind of dedicated space to create windows for us to look into each other's kind of cultural, ethnic backgrounds and to kind of share in that. No.
Yeah. it's a start, right? It's not everything. It certainly presents an opportunity for us to say, like, I want to learn more about you. I want to learn, what makes Rico Rico. I want to understand what makes Moses Moses. And in that way, we're co-creating a culture that we all feel like we can be seen and we can be heard, as opposed to kind of going with whatever the dominant culture is in that area, especially if you're in an organization where you are a minority and you're like the only one or one of a small set of people that look like you.
Yeah, so we've mentioned the dominant culture a couple of times, and I wonder if we can just kind of sketch out for people what exactly that means if they're not quite sure.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about, white dominant spaces in the workplace. And we've talked about it from a perspective of, naming it white supremacy culture that is a part of what is happening in the workplace that sets the norms and the standards for how we are supposed to show up, how we are supposed to act. But if you're not a white person, what happens then?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also worth repeating here that it's not that we're saying that being a white person is a negative thing, but this construct of whiteness is something that flattens identity, much in the same way that, for example, I can categorize myself as Asian American, and that is true, but it's not the totality of who I am, right? There's more specificity to it than that. So if I'm getting really specific, I'm actually Filipino American. And that experience is distinct from this broad kind of faceless Asian American category. So these cultural heritage months, they're not only about Black and brown people or people who have, different, like, they're part of the broad spectrum of human sexuality in some way, or like gender identity. Whiteness is actually a part of this too. So like St. Patrick's Day is a calendar celebration, for
Right.
example, right? There's Italian Heritage Month as well. And these are distinct experiences that help us to kind of challenge the idea of the monolith, that we are all the same in some respect. And that's
Culture is
true and useful sometimes, but if we're like that all the time, then we lose some of that nuance, I think is the point we're driving at here.
I agree. I think culture is one of those things that it's we're all multicultural in so many ways. Like you're expressing you're identifying as Asian American, but then you have your ethnicity, which is Filipino. And
Mhm.
so white people are part of that conversation as well. It's like acknowledging that, hey, my grandmother is, Italian, and there's a part of my heritage where we have that Italian culture that makes me part of who I am. And so just thinking about the layers and how there's intersectionality, like we are not just like one homogeneous like thing. We are layered and we are different, and it's celebrating the differences that helps us bring awareness and understanding of each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like us being intentional about it. I think is what is one of the positives is being intentional about finding those differences and celebrating them is what makes it really good.
So, I mean, I kind of feel like, there's maybe sometimes a disconnect here because people see these celebrations and they see the word history, and so automatically they're thinking about the past. So, for the two of you, why is it that referencing our past is so important for, how we're experiencing the present?
Good question. I think thinking about it from a perspective of when we're thinking about present culture and past experiences, just as we were talking earlier, it's intergenerational, right? Like
Mhm.
I bring the experiences of my grandmother, my grandfather, my aunts and uncles, all of that makes up who I am. And it's great to celebrate and to showcase the legacy, but it's also time where we can say, well, what are we doing today that is helping that community? What are we doing today that's taking intentional action? So this isn't like a performative thing where we're just putting something up on social media and saying like celebrate Black excellence or whatever the case may be. No, it's an opportunity for you to really look at what are you doing in your organization today so that you're making things better for that community in the future? And that's where that intentional action comes into play.
Definitely. So I guess that's kind of leading us to this question of like, we see organizations out there trying to celebrate every single cultural heritage month or every single calendar day. And I don't know, like sometimes I've seen these campaigns on social media or, commercials on TV, and it kind of leaves me cold. It's like I have trouble connecting to it. So I don't know if either of you have any insight on that or what you make of those kinds of, you know, on paper, really inclusive efforts.
I think what you're probably smelling out there is the inauthenticity. I think that employees of an organization, the clients of an organization, as well as the consumers, they can smell when something isn't authentic to that brand or to that organization.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes that's what we see when the message in the company or the way that it's displayed doesn't fit. And I think that's really important for organizations to do things that are authentic to them, so it doesn't come off as performative or just a show.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess, so if we're being authentic, like how does that kind of help to guide us to what to celebrate or even why to celebrate something, So for me, this kind of seems to touch on what we talk about in DEI circles as like intent versus impact, right? So like, what do you mean to happen versus what is the actual impact of the thing that happens? And I sense that organizations, what they're really going after is impact. Well, that is the intent, but I don't know. How do we get to that maximal kind of impact rather than just like good intentions?
Yeah, I love what you said, Moses, about authenticity, right? Like, what is authentic to your organization? One of the questions that we started to ask first was, who's here at all ACEs, right? Who do we have on our staff? This started as a communications question, right? Like, what do we want to communicate? And it really is about opening up the door of communication with your own people and saying to them, who are you and what do you want to celebrate? Like, what is authentic to them is going to be the people that you have in your culture, the communities that you work with, the work that you do, your values, your mission. That's what your why should be. Like, it shouldn't be there's a date on the calendar or a month on the calendar and we should put something on social media. That feels performative to me. If you're celebrating Black History Month on social media, but you don't have Black people on your staff, then that's not authentic. That's not actually having that impact that you really want. So I would start by like considering who is on your staff and asking them, don't make this a decision of someone that's on the communications team, or, this should be an organizational wide conversation. And then when you open it up to your staff, making sure that you listen to what they say and how they identify and how they want to be celebrated.
Yeah, that's a great point, Janine. I love that about making space for your employees and listening to what they want, right? So the best intentions don't have the impact because a lot of times they overlook the people that they're meant to impact. So like you said, what do they want? What are they looking for? And make that space so they feel comfortable celebrating or not, or speaking up if they want to see something different.
So if I'm just kind of imagining here, right? So I'm somebody on a leadership team at an organization watching this right now. And I'm hearing what you're both saying. It's making a lot of sense to me. But then, like, how do I actually go about it and put this into practice, for example? Like, what are some ways that maybe you could see this kind of conversation taking place?
Good question. I think I'll take a stab and I'll pass it over to Moses. from a communication standpoint, I think it is creating that space, having those conversations internally, whether that's like a survey that you put out or an all staff meeting or a conversation that is led by facilitators like us, where you're talking about what those heritage months mean to you and identity in the workplace. I think that's a place to start. And then thinking about how you can pull in and tie all of those things to your values and your mission, and how you're celebrating cultural identity and diversity that are aligned with who you say you are and what you say you do and the work that you're doing out there, in whatever space you're in. And I think there's also something to say about, like, sometimes it can feel like false advertising when you're communicating, like,
Yeah.
maybe you want diversity, right? You want to hire more diverse people. So you want to put something out there in the world that shows that, hey, we value diversity. But if you're doing that and you're celebrating Pride Month, for example, but you're not creating a space in your organization where people that identify as LGBTQIA plus don't feel safe, then you're doing a disservice to your organization by saying, like, hey, we value diversity, but the people that we have here, we're not creating a safe workplace for them. We're not changing our policies and our practices, and the way that we actually operate to make it safe for people. So if you are trying to attract those people and they come there, they're going to be like, wait a minute, this is not what I signed up for. And they're going to leave, and you're going to have an issue with retention.
Yeah, because I've never applied for a job and said, oh, you know what really appeals to me about this organization is they're going to exploit my personal identity characteristics for their bottom line. Like, I really want to work for that company, right?
Right.
So if we're creating the space to authentically connect with an organization's workforce, and that creates the opportunity to align real employee concerns and what they invest their time and energy into with, say, like the broader communication strategy or the goals of the organization, like what kinds of opportunities might be unlocked, for example. So again, if I'm that leadership team person out there watching, and I'm saying, like, yeah, okay, creating space, creating authenticity, cool, but like, what does that actually look like, or what could that look like?
I think that's a great question, and kind of to Janeen's point earlier, it unfortunately looks different for every organization, depending on the makeup, the demographics. So it's not a one size fits all, but it does mean kind of one of the most important things of listening to those employees, and making that space for them to tell you whatever it is that they want. And I think that's one of the building blocks.
Mm. So I definitely hear that. And I guess part of why I'm asking that question is I look around, like at the start of Black History Month, right? MLK was on all of my feeds. And what struck me was MLK, great, great, great leader, great human being, of course, incredible orator. But why is every year it seems like more and more he's becoming the sum totality of Black history, and that's just simply not the case, right? So how do we, I don't know, do the two of you see what we're talking about as the opportunity to go deeper, and if so, like, what are the positives of doing so, if you see any?
I think we talked, when we were preparing for the show, we talked about this, and also just in preparing for our own content during Black History Month, we talked about this as well. And when you have a cultural heritage month, it provides you with an opportunity to learn something new about that culture, right? So if everybody knows Martin Luther King Jr., what are the heroes that are lesser known that we can create space for, trying to create opportunities to know and understand something that, lesser known facts about Black history, lesser known facts about other cultures. That's what this provides for us. It's not just a time to kind of blast out the same people over and over again every year.
Mm.
I think that also goes to the point too about we're talking about the history, using your history to for the future, and looking at those things and honoring that legacy of, like you said, those historic Black towns that are little known, that a lot of people don't know about, or other things in the diaspora of Blackness that deserve to be mentioned and acknowledged just the same.
Both good points. We do have another comment coming in here from Stephen once again, which is, I believe that as a country, we've bought too much into the idea that we are a melting pot. We are all here, yes, but it doesn't mean that our identities are all the same. Individualism is what makes us unique, and that seems to have been forgotten. I don't know. Any thoughts? Any response? I can leave that up. That was a lengthy comment.
I like that point that you're making, Stephen. And I feel like, the reason why we started talking about this and we had this question at All Aces was because it was Filipino American History Month. And, at All Aces, one of our values is practice what we preach. And Rico, you had posted something online about Filipino American History Month. And Stephen is a former colleague of ours. He had mentioned to you that we didn't celebrate Filipino American History Month as a team, as an organization, and that sparked this whole conversation as
Mm.
people that are working in diversity. You know, what are we celebrating in our organization as All Aces, and how did that affect you as a team member? And I feel like that was a really important moment for us to think about it from a perspective of like not social media posts and content planning, but from a place of humanity and understanding each other's identity. And I know, curiously, we talked about it same way for Black History Month. Like, how did it impact us? Because we didn't do a big team celebration for Black History Month either.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember one of the things that we grappled with is there was some awareness on our parts that there were outside expectations that as a diversity company, we would, of course, have some kind of official celebration or something, which of course we can continue to talk about in a little bit. But to answer the question you posed earlier, which is how did it impact me when we did not have a celebration for Filipino American history? Well, on one level, I wasn't really surprised because not a lot of people know when Filipino American History Month happens, which would make sense if you are not Filipino American. That said, we are the second largest Asian ethnicity in the United States, which a lot of people don't know. And so I guess there was some, I don't know, some not exactly resonance there, but it wasn't surprising, right? So we are the second largest Asian ethnicity in America, but most people don't know that. So in some sense, we are kind of, or I am used to that identity not being so at the forefront. So to have a team member kind of acknowledge and support what I was putting out there, it did feel good. There was a sense of recognition there. And even though this is the first kind of setting where I've worked in that was not majority white, there were still some of the same dynamics, right? Like I didn't expect the majority to be aware of the things that affected me on that kind of identity level, which I thought was kind of interesting. And of course, none of it was malicious, none of it was intentional, but it just made me reflect a little bit. And so I guess I'm curious to hear from the two of you, right? So now you are in a work setting where you're part of the majority, and you're Black History Month was not made a central focus in any way. So did that? I mean, how was that for you too?
I can start. I feel for me personally that there's a difference between what it means to celebrate Cultural Heritage Months when I was in a predominantly white space versus now here at All Aces, which is predominantly people of color, right? And at this point in time, we are majority Black. We identify as Black. Um, and when I was in a predominantly white space, and oftentimes I was in a predominantly male white space, I felt like I needed to see the organization celebrate Black History Month. I needed to see them celebrate Women's History Month. And not only did I need them to do it, like I was part of organizing it, I was part of planning it. I was like, we are doing this, yay. I'm celebrating me and feeling pride in that. And it was because I didn't feel seen day to day in that environment. But now that I'm in a majority minority space, I feel like I don't need the Black History Month celebration, especially because I feel like I'm allowed to be like bring all of my culture and all of my cultural facets of who I am to work every day. And so it's interesting because I hadn't thought about it before now that like I don't need the Black History Month celebration. I don't need to see those things posted on social media. I think it's also because it's part of our DNA, like equality and kind of having inclusion in the workplace is part of what we do at All Aces, and we're doing the work. So we're working with other organizations on their policies and practices, and we're changing what diversity means in the workplace for other organizations. And so I feel like it's less of a need for me to have a party because we're doing that work every single day. And I feel, I feel like I can be me every single day at work at All Aces.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about that in that way. You know, what it's bringing to mind for me is I lived in Vietnam for several years, and I ended up celebrating Christmas and the 4th of July uh, in a more focused way than I would have in the US. You know, just much more aware that this was something that I was doing and not necessarily everyone else was doing. Um, and yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think it seems like a small thing, but recognizing people and the culture and history that brought them into being, it's not actually a small thing, right? It's intrinsically woven in with our humanity and our identity. So it's like glossing over it just doesn't ever feel good.
I'm curious, Moses, if you feel the same way about Black History Month at all.
I was gonna say I love what you said about feeling seen, not feeling seen before, and feeling seen now, because it's exactly how I feel, but was never able to actually put it into those words. And it's exactly right. When you feel seen and you're at a company that is working day to day on diversity and equity, you don't need the show of something to let that that you're cared for or that you're seen. As you said, we're doing the work daily, and we know the impact we're having. So it goes back to our point about being authentic. It's authentic for us in a woman-owned majority minority company that we feel the diversity. We practice these things, and we hope to push those with our and the clients and the work that we do every day.
I think when you were expressing, feeling seen by that example you shared, Rico, during Filipino American History Month, it was an opportunity for us, right? So because we had that moment where we were talking about identity, we decided from now on, we have a platform, right? We have this show that we do monthly. And instead of us we're a small team with limited resources. So instead of us spending a bunch of time on social media posting things every month, what we decided to do was actually incorporate talking about identity, talking about cultural heritage in this show every month.
Mhm.
So instead of it being like, yay, let's celebrate and have a party, it is we're using our platform to share knowledge and to unpack its issues of diversity, to talk about culture, to talk about identity, to open up the space for people to share their own stories and experiences. And that's what's authentic to All Aces.
Mm. Yeah, so it sounds like one of the things that we're saying is that curiosity can be an expression of authenticity. But it's when, I think it's also worth mentioning that that can be kind of a blurry line sometimes because there are ways of approaching curiosity in which it can be very respectful and other ways where it can be more like, I don't know, more, I don't know what the word is, but it's like there's a difference between admiring something from afar and looking at it like it's there for your enjoyment, So like you can look at an animal in the wild and appreciate it, or you can be like the kid with his face smushed against the glass at the zoo throwing popcorn at the monkeys, and that's not it's not a good look.
Yeah.
So if we're kind of, well, here we are. We're talking about how All Aces kind of celebrates these calendar celebrations, as well as kind of like how do we connect to our authenticity. Is it an issue that we're doing this on the very last day of Black History Month? Or if there's people out there watching, we're saying like, oh, well, I guess I've missed my chance this month to connect to my authenticity. How would you react to that? Or what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think one of the points we had kind of brought up when we're talking through this is Valentine's Day happens during Black History Month, and it's one of those really big commercial holidays where guys are made to feel like they need to spend an exorbitant amount of money on flowers for their loved one. And I was kind of making the point that I buy flowers for my wife every couple of weeks, maybe 4 to 6 weeks or so on. She likes flowers. I'm a botanist on the weekend, so it works. But what I don't have is that guilty feeling that I need to like go and buy this super expensive bouquet on Valentine's Day to show my love and appreciation. I've been doing it throughout the year, and it's nice to do. It doesn't mean I don't have to on that date, but it's not that performative. I don't. There's not that performative responsibility that I have to. Because I'm being pushed again, like we were saying, pushed by outside forces to feel like, I need to do something. I need to post. I need to. So I think, it again goes to, making this part of your DNA, making this part of something that you do daily. So it doesn't have to be such a deal.
I love that Valentine's Day. That's a perfect example of when sometimes things can feel very performative. If you are a horrible husband and then on Valentine's Day you show up with a bouquet of flowers, is that really authentic to the relationship and the love that you have or that you're showing to your wife every day? There's also, I love what you said about showing it, right? Like you feel this pressure from society or from wherever that's making you feel like, there's some kind of shaming culture out there that's like, oh, you have to say something because it's Black History Month. And if you don't, then, there's something wrong with you as an organization or whatever the case may be. And it feels a lot like peer pressure, right? Like it's like this, cancel culture and all of that stuff that's wrapped into it. And so I feel like that you shouldn't fall into that pressure. If you're doing something behind the scenes that's more authentic to you and that is actually going to have a greater impact, then do the thing behind the scenes,
I wonder if you can flesh that out for the audience a little bit, right? So, like, why, if you're doing things behind the scenes, if you're having a real impact, then aren't people going to notice that too? And how is that maybe like not performative in its own way?
We were thinking about some examples when we were kind of thinking about the show. And Moses, I think you had a good one.
It's leaving.
We were talking about, well, there are a couple of things we were talking about. We were talking about, Rico, you had talked about Cinco de Mayo.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if you want to share a little bit about like your knowledge on Cinco de Mayo.
Oh, sure. So, for those who don't know, Cinco de Mayo is in fact not Mexico's Independence Day. Or rather, maybe it's more accurate to say it is a celebration of independence, but not of Mexico from Spain. It's celebrating Mexico's independence from France, which is a relatively minor period in Mexican history, if I'm remembering correctly. But it was picked up by the Coors Brewing Corporation, a couple decades ago as part of a marketing push to sell more beer during a low time of the year to local Mexican people. So,
and then it becomes a celebration of going out and buying more beer, as opposed to it being a celebration about Mexican culture or history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Janine, now I remember the point I was making about the you were making the point about peer pressure and how, companies have this shame or this peer pressure that they have to do something. And what happens a lot of times, I think, is where we get these companies that come out of the left field with like these weird products or these weird messages that have little to no impact at all. Going, Rico, back to your statement, like a couple of years ago, we had the Walmart, the Juneteenth ice cream, and I'm sure, in some memo somewhere, it was like, hey, let's celebrate Black History Month by making a Juneteenth ice cream. And it was quickly, shouted down. And, there's a memo that comes out and we apologize when we look at your company, it's not diverse. It's not equitable for your employees or even for the surrounding businesses. So that's, something inauthentic. And I think it really goes back to that point again.
yeah. And I don't know, like one thing that kind of bothered me about that whole story, just remembering it now, is like thinking about all the people that had to have been involved. Like there's a whole team that came up with not just the packaging, but they had to decide on the flavor, right? Like what is the flavor of Juneteenth? And then it had to go through testing. They had focus groups and whatever packaging, and somehow it made it through these lengthy processes all the way to production, right? So many people along the way, and then it hits the shelves and outrage, right?
Yeah.
So absolute nightmare.
But I think it goes back to what you were saying. Like, do you have people on your staff, on the marketing team, on the communications team that are people of color? They would have been like, excuse me, wait one moment. Is this a joke? But you have to have those people there in your organization, and you have to have the ability to have them be at the table when these decisions are being made, or that there are shared decision-making processes across your organization, so that people can raise their hand and say, like, this doesn't feel right. But that goes back to policies, practices, and who you've hired and who you're retaining.
I think in some perverse way, it actually shows that they aren't diverse, that product was able to launch, right?
Right.
It shows the lack of, we're talking about talking to your employees. How would your employees like to be celebrated? I'm sure that wouldn't have been one of the things. So it kind of shows how.
Yeah. And I mean, I imagine even if there were, say, for example, Black people who are involved, it raises to the surface questions of why they wouldn't necessarily want to speak up, And I think, it's not hard to imagine you're somebody working at an organization that's dead set on producing this ice cream, and everybody but you thinks it's a good idea. Maybe you're not a very powerful person. Maybe you don't hold a high position. So if you put yourself out there in a real way, you are putting your livelihood at risk.
That's
Yeah,
so
for
real.
sure.
That's so real. There's so many places where maybe there are those people, that there is uh, technically a Black person in the room, but do they feel comfortable speaking up in that environment? Do you create a culture where, different voices can be celebrated in the room? Like, do you feel do I, as Black woman, feel safe talking in this big conference room? And sharing my ideas. And then when I do share my ideas, are they validated? Are they heard? Are they encouraged? You get into that place where you might be there, you might have representation in the room, but you don't have a culture that's safe for that person to actually share their ideas and be themselves.
I think that's so important, Janine, too, is, representation, but then having a voice. So, that's a easily slid under the rug. Well, we have people of color on the staff, or, we asked the one, Latino guy what he thought, but like you said, does that person feel like they have a voice? Do they feel like they'll be reprimanded? Do they feel any kind of power to speak their true mind? That is really important.
I think it's also just, if there is something that's going to be done in relation to, say, my identity, then not only do I want it to represent me, but I want it to be something that I like, something that's positive in my eyes, right? So I'm thinking back to the start of the month where I think it was Aramark. They served a school on the first day of Black History Month, like fried chicken and watermelon as the meal. Now, there's nothing wrong with serving fried chicken at a school lunch. There's nothing wrong with serving watermelon at a school lunch. However, that particular combination, there are particular overtones. There's certain associations that have evolved within our culture that are not positive representations of Black people or Black history.
That's
And so, yeah, go ahead.
that's the part about the how. How are you celebrating cultural differences? How are you doing it in a way that is not performative, right? Like, this is a school setting. This is literally where education happens. And so instead of having fried chicken for Black History Month, what what things are happening at the school around the curriculum that is exploring more than Martin Luther King Jr., that
Yeah.
is having conversations at the appropriate learning level for those students to explore Black history and all of the different facets of the Black diaspora, right? The Black experience is very varied, just like the Hispanic experience is very varied. Like, just like any group, like, there's not one way to be Black, there's not one way to be Hispanic, there's not one way to be LGBTQIA, like all of these variations of us and who we are. There should be an intention of how you're celebrating it in a way that is not, let's have fried chicken for Black History Month.
Right. And part of that conversation is it's just so reductive, right? It's like, there's much more to the Black experience than what people eat. And there's some great documentaries and things out there now that kind of go into the history of, say, soul food and many of the regional delicacies and food ways that have evolved among Black Americans. And I do think that food is a wonderful way of communicating and experiencing culture, but unless you're going to go into it with that kind of critical eye, that critical appreciation, then what are you actually trying to achieve?
Exactly. Goes back to the why and the impact, intent versus
Yeah.
impact, that we were
Yeah.
talking about earlier. And like, especially, I have a passion for for the education space. I have two brown boys, and this idea, when I my son was in elementary school. He came home and his school decided to create a race and ethnicity committee. And I was on the committee. And so during Black History Month, we, looked around the school to see what representation there was of Black people. And so we did something around that. We looked at the curriculum, and each person on the committee decided they were going to go into the classroom for each grade and create some different type of activities around understanding the Black experience that was different. And like, it was a collective process, right? Like, it was this committee, it was the principal, it was the, public school system that gave us funding to do activities. Like, it took the whole of everyone trying to celebrate Black History Month in a way that like didn't put the pressure on just one team or one people or one person. It was a collective effort. And I think sometimes when people do go into wanting to celebrate these cultural heritage months, they're like, okay, well, the Black ERG needs to figure that out.
Right.
Or, the LGBTQ plus IA team needs to figure that out. No, this should be like a collective community thing if it's authentic. If you really want to have impact, then like, let's as an organization figure this out. Let's get on this together and like work in co-creating culture. That's how you actually make change.
Yeah, so I think another aspect of these cultural heritage celebrations that gets glossed over is on a very large scale. It's kind of an attempt to help kind of move the ball on how we conceive of us, right? So like who we are, not just as like smaller groups, but these larger identities. So in conflict resolution, we talk about what's called like superordinate identities. That is the like kind of umbrella identity that we have. So if you want to think about this in terms of national nations, rather, or countries, like the three of us here are all Americans, right? So that would be one of our superordinate identities. Another one that we share is, of course, we all work at All Aces. So we all have that identity in common too. But depending on context, who quote unquote we are will change, right? And so there are many people that think of their primary identity might be as a Black person. It might be as somebody from California. It might be as different identities hold different emotional resonances for people for many reasons. But if people have a hard time imagining us as like multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, then of course you end up having these often very bitter like us and them dynamics that follow along those racial or ethnic lines.
It's very true. So what do you do about it? You celebrate cultural heritage months in an authentic way.
But if we are thinking of like concrete things that people can do, like we have mentioned a couple of them here, but if we're closing out with some intention, then what are things that people can be trying, maybe not for Black History Month, which of course today is the last day, but for anything else that might be coming on the calendar?
Yeah, I think, going back to, a point we've made a couple of times now is just be authentic is what's coming up for me the most. Not just generically mentioning a culture because it's their month or, hey, it's April 1st, insert cultural heritage month here. But actually look at that as a time to become more knowledgeable about that culture. And then, making space and nurturing a culture inside your organization where employees feel like they have the space to do so. No one wants to have anything forced or pushed down their throat or something that's, inauthentic to be paraded around. So, I think, creating that space and being authentic and making sure that your organization has a culture where that's available.
So if we're really drilling down on that one, Moses, like what might that look like kind of day to day? Like for example, one thing I've noticed working at All Aces is, in contrast to other places where I've worked, in our kind of weekly end of the week catch up sessions, I've noticed that the team will very openly talk about aspects of, say, like Black popular culture or music. What I've noticed in other places that I worked is like sometimes I would see, groups of my Black coworkers talking about something like music or TV shows or whatever, but then once other non-Black people entered the room, they would kind of like that conversation would come to a close. I don't think it was necessarily like conscious even, but it seemed like it was more of an awareness, like, oh, there are other people here. They're not going to get what we're talking about. Like let's change the conversation or something.
I think it's a matter of like everyone has the opportunity to grow and be curious, right? So if in our conversations that we have at All Aces, we're having these conversations open and freely, and anybody can join and anybody can add to it. I think there's been situations where like someone would come up to me and be like, "So this Beyonce song,
Just
yeah,
like that.
tell me, like, I don't understand it. Tell me about it, blah, 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 blah." And I would be like, well, I'm actually not a Beyonce fan. And I don't know that song. And so there's like this weird, this thing about like, when is curiosity harmful and when is it not? I think when you're in a space and you see someone having a conversation about them, about something like music or whatever, you have that opportunity to come from a place of curiosity where you're not making assumptions about that culture or that person. So if you do notice that people are talking about something and you want to join the conversation, like come to it with curiosity where you're like truly trying to understand, come from a place of understanding and not from a place of like, okay, you're the Black person, so you're going to tell me about that Black thing.
I think that's such an important part. That negative assumption really makes the curiosity part, really is a turnoff a lot of times. You notice something different about someone and, figuring out how to couch it, how to say what it is or how to, ask your question while still acknowledging and affirming their humanity. It can get really tricky, I believe.
Yeah, and I feel like, that's something that a lot of our clients are concerned about. But again, that authenticity, if you're really focusing on wanting to know something, right, then often people will give you a pass because they can see that you don't know what you're asking about and that you earnestly want to learn. But if you're writing in there like, hey, tell me about why the thing that you like is not as good as what I like or what's normal, like that just doesn't feel great.
I think if that person would have came up to me, like in our conversations at All Aces, when we talk about whatever it is we're bringing to the table in our conversation, like if someone would have came to me and said, what kind of music do you like? This is the type of music I like. I could tell you a little bit about, like, I'm really interested in learning more about like different types of music. That is a very different place of coming to curiosity with understanding than just like making an assumption that I like this type of artist and this type of music because I'm Black. So I think I love curiosity. I think everyone should come and bring their curiosity to the workplace, but bring it from a place of understanding. And I think when you were talking earlier about like, what can we leave people with, knowing your why. Why are you celebrating these cultural heritage months? Who are the people in your organization? What are they identifying as? And then going beyond just looking at the calendar and posting something on social media. So is there something that you can do in that community, for example? Can you start an internship or a fellowship program to provide opportunity for future generations? Can you review your hiring process and look at what might be getting in the way of you diversifying your team? What are your paths to promotion? What's your performance management process look like? Is it equitable? Really using that calendar to look at, like, okay, let's look at the Black population in our organization, and let's look at our practices and policies and structures to see how we can actually make an impact for the Black community based on who we are, who we say we are, our values, and what we do.
So we've mentioned knowing your why a couple times in this episode, but I wonder if we can kind of like, if somebody's out there watching this and struggling to come up with their why, like how could we possibly guide them through that process? Or like, what does a good why look like, for example?
There's no cookie cutter, right? Like Moses mentioned that earlier. There's no cookie cutter answer to the question of, like, well, which heritage months do we celebrate? You have to really think about your resources, who you are, what your values are as an organization, and start from there. And I think one of the things that all ACEs, why we are able to have these conversations and able to do the work that we do, is that we have a value of collective care. We come from a place where we're starting with humanity. We're starting with the intention of having care for ourselves, but also for having care for each other. And so coming up with your why is really going to be based on your unique organization. But the point of it is, like, your why should be what allows you to have a path forward. It's like the core of what you do in every step that you make. And if you're coming from a place of intention, and you're wanting to come from a place of humanity and collective care and caring about your people, the people around you, your community, the people you work with, then you can't go wrong, but you have to always go back to that.
Yeah, so I guess in contrast, like if we're thinking about a why that's not great, it would be like, well, why should we celebrate Black History Month? Well, because Janeen and Moses are Black, right? That's just not.
Don't do that.
It's a little bit thin, right?
Correct.
Do it in a way that really is authentic to you. I think Moses has talked about authenticity, and that's really key.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, what's wonderful is this, conversation came about because of the space that we've created at All Aces to have this conversation, right? So, the conversation started some time ago, and then, us chewing on that into a show idea. So because that space is made, because we can be honest with each other, and talk to Rico and how he feels about this situation, and we can kind of chew on it, then the space was made for this show to happen. So this goes back to just it being a part of the company's DNA, that we are able to have these conversations open and honest, without fear of reprimand or anything.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, part of what we've been talking about here, it kind of, it's strange to think that, like, organizations often have no problem celebrating an individual person's birthday, right? They'll make space. If you remember when we were all in the office, there would be a cake at some point, little chit chat, get together, we'd all relax for a little bit. That's fine. But then people get very nervous around these calendar celebrations, right? But if we think about it, like, we're celebrating the people, that's the point, right? The birthday, you're celebrating the person. These cultural heritage months, you're celebrating that person through another lens. I think that's maybe a little bit more palatable than, like, oh, we're celebrating a group of people who I may not have met many members of in my life, right? That is weird, right? But if you're celebrating Janeen, you're celebrating Moses and some of the experience that, has shaped your lives, your expertise, your career trajectories, then I think that's a very different thing.
Like adding some personalization to it. I like that.
Yeah.
All right. Any final thoughts as we close out here?
Well, I think that was a good way to end it. Like, thinking about it from you're celebrating a person, celebrate the person, and let it be something that you do in a way that celebrates humanity and is authentic.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you all for being here with us today. And we will be back sometime next month with another episode of Intentionally Act Live. Until then, be well. And this is Enrico Manalo, Janeen Williamson, and Moses Collins III.